Moving to the southern border of Judah, it's important to mention that the unprecedented flourishing of Selman experience in the Beersheba Arad valleys in the course of the 7th century BCE was short-lived. In most of the Negev sites, one can detect clear evidence of the destruction that took place at the end of the Iron Age. The question is if the Babylonians intentionally destroyed this region or it collapsed when the Judahite king couldn't support the people who lived there and couldn't protect them anymore. In at least one of the fortresses in the Negev, it may be hypothesized that there was an orderly abandonment before the place was destroyed. In contrast, clear-cut evidence of the destruction at the beginning of the 6th century BCE was found in other forts and small settlements. In all the area, there are signs that after the destruction, there was a settlement gap at least until the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. The survey data further reinforces the evidence of dramatic process of destruction and abandonment that took place in the Beersheba Arad valleys with only a small-scale recovery in the Persian period, mainly by Edomite and Arab tribes. Archaeological criteria cannot help determine the precise time period of the wave of devastation of the sites in the Negev. Was it in 597 BCE, 586 BCE, or perhaps even later? We can't know the time gaps between the destruction of each of the various sites. Was it one short period of destruction following a planned military campaign? Maybe a sporadic episodes of destruction following a series of offensives by different agents? We can't know also the identity of those responsible for the destruction. Was it Babylonian army, Edomite tribes, semi-nomadic tribes from an Edomite Arab origin? The answer to these questions are all part of historical reconstruction. In my opinion, it is doubtful that the Babylonians had any reason to invest efforts in conquering border fortresses in remote districts when these would have collapsed anyway with the disappearance of the army and the central administration of the kingdom. It seems that the gradual collapse undergone by the area of fortresses and settlements in the Beersheba Arad Valley is the best explanation for the archaeological finds and the historical, demographic, and geopolitical processes, even though this explanation cannot be proved either archaeologically or historically. The existence of the settlement in this region was depending upon the ability of the kingdom of Judah to defend it, and when Judah was no longer able to do so, whether on the eve of the destruction or even in the process continued after the destruction, the border fortresses collapsed, and with them the entire area of settlements. After the destruction, there was a marked process of evacuation of the area that continued for most of the 6th century BCE, and a diminished settlement began to re-establish itself only in the 5th century BCE. The same historical process probably took place in the Jordan Valley, Judean Desert, and along the western littorals of the Dead Sea. At the end of the Iron Age, an unprecedented flowering took place in the eastern region of the Kingdom of Judah. Jericho and En-Gedi were agricultural and industrial centers that supported a whole area of settlements, particularly along the routes that connected these centers with the economic and political centers on the mountain ridge. The entire area of settlements in the eastern hinterland of the Kingdom of Judah was destroyed at the end of the Iron Age, apparently as a result of the collapse of the military and economic system after Jerusalem was destroyed. After a certain period of absolute vacuum in settlement activity in the entire region, settlement in Jericho and En-Gedi was renewed during the 5th century BCE, but in small scale and as a very isolated sites. The data from the surveys conducted in the region give conclusive evidence of the intensity of settlement activity as well as the intensity of the settlement collapse that transpired in the early 6th century BCE. The area was totally deserted in the 6th century BCE, and only the main sites of En-Gedi and Jericho were rebuilt in the Persian period. Let's summarize the archaeological data. The Babylonian campaign brought about an utter and deliberate destruction in Jerusalem and its immediate environs. The region was almost completely emptied of its population and remained so until the beginning of the Persian period. As part of the Babylonian military activity, the fortresses of Judah's western border were also destroyed. The Shephelah was emptied of its inhabitants. In contrast, it seemed that the hinterland areas in the south and to the east of the kingdom toppled in a longer, more complex process that eventually also led to a ruinous consequences. The border fortresses of the Judean kingdom in the Beersheba Arad valleys collapsed as well, together with the settlement that had existed alongside of them. Tribal elements that had previously resided in close proximity, consisting primarily of Arabian and Edomian tribes, began to make incursions into the vast and relatively empty space north of the Negev to the southern part of the Shephelah and the Hebron Hills. The demographic meaning of the archaeological process and conclusions as presented above is clear. Between the end of the Iron Age and the Persian period, there was a demographic and settlement crisis. The number of inhabitants of the kingdom of Judah as it came to an end was approximately 110,000 people. After the destruction of Jerusalem, during the Babylonian period, the number of people living in Judah dropped to 1/3 of it and may be estimated in about 40,000 people. The surprising number that will be discussed in the next part of this course is that during the Persian period, in the time of the return from the exile, the number of Judahites living in Judah continued to drop and can be estimated in 30,000 people. These demographic assessments have great significance in reconstructing the historical processes that transpired in Judah between the 7th and the 5th centuries BCE, because they allow a different perspective of the biblical descriptions that, until now, have served as the almost exclusive source for all historical discussions. Thus, for example, it seems that the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of the kingdom of Judah brought about the gravest demographic crisis in the history of the kingdom of Judah. The Babylonians concentrated their effort on Jerusalem and its immediate environs, while the Benjamin region and the northern Judean hills were hardly touched and continued to exist almost unchanged. The data on settlement and demography may lend support to the historical premise that most of the exiled to Babylon had been residents of Jerusalem. It is also reasonable to assume that the Babylonians dealt a major military blow to the inhabitants of the Shephelah, and it was probably residents of this region also who were deported to Babylon. As mentioned, the process of collapse and destruction of the settlements of the kingdom's eastern and southern border areas are still unclear, but it is doubtful either that they were destroyed as a result of a Babylonian military campaign or that a significant part of the population was taken from the small sites into the Babylonian exile. There is no evidence of the deportation of population from either the Benjamin region or the northern Judean hills. It seems that if there was such an act of exile, it would have been limited in number, and from the demographic point of view, it was insignificant. Since most of the deportation was of elite and urban population, and Jerusalem was the main target of the Babylonians, it is easy to understand why one of the major archaeological phenomena in the 6th century BCE Judah after the destruction of Jerusalem was a sharp decline in urban life. The same situation continued throughout the Persian period when, despite the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the restoration of its status as the capital of the province, there was no strengthening of urban life, and the settlement in Judah remained largely based on the rural population. This sharp decline in urban life has other implications on the material culture, like the disappearance of the typical family burial caves, usually associated with urban and other elite classes in society. This is a reflection of deep religious and social change. Since there is a continued use of some of the burial caves in the area of Benjamin, in Jerusalem and other sites, there is no need to connect it to the Isolate crisis of 586 BCE, but to a broader and gradual change in religion and society. This change occurred during the 6th century BCE and possibly mainly at the beginning of the Persian period, when other changes, such as the disappearance of iconography in stamp impressions on jar handles, occurred. Other elements that emphasize the change in material culture from the Iron Age to the Persian period, like the disappearance of the typical Judahite house, are probably part of a gradual change that had already begun during the 7th century BCE and continued for hundreds of years afterwards, with some typical four-room houses still built during the 6th century BCE, like the houses in Tel Enatzbe, biblical Mitzpah. Looking from the data that was just presented about the 6th century down to the Persian period, and not only backwards to the late First Temple period and the time of the destruction, we may emphasize one more important conclusion. One of the most noteworthy conclusions that emerges from the demographic data is that the return to Zion left no archaeological evidence. At the end of the 6th and the beginning of the 5th century BCE, there is a marked dwindling of settlement, particularly in the Benjamin region, and there is no indication whatsoever of either a demographic increase or any change in settlement pattern. The demographic figures from Jerusalem region also attest that even at the height of the Persian period, the city's population was only few hundreds, maybe to 1,000 people. Even if all the residents of the region were among those who made the return to Zion from the Babylonian exile, these returnees only amounted to several hundreds.